It wasn't the power of the free market, private enterprise, or those pesky Yanks that were communism's biggest enemy. Communism's biggest enemy was, is, has been, and always will be other communists. We may view the Cold War from the perspective of the side who, quote-unquote, won, or at the very least didn't implode. However, from the end of the Second World War all the way up to today, the relationship between the unified workers of the world has been anything but unified. Red countries might call the capitalist West their number one target, but history shows that whenever communists get trigger happy, they always take down their own first. Look at Russia and China. Even today, though they may have officially shaken off the Cold War era governments, they present a unified front against the evil imperialistic United States of America. Not that they would ever admit that. Yet, a closer look reveals their relationship is far from a perfect marriage. Petty squabbles and ideological differences almost resulted in the Soviets nuking China into oblivion. Thankfully, the US and others persuaded the two former friends to bury the hatchet. And the result? China lived to become the global superpower the Soviet Union dreamed of becoming. Now it is Russia who is dependent on the CCP to maintain its place on the world stage. An embarrassing change of pace. It wasn't that long ago when China was Russia's lapdog, being fed scraps from the dinner table. They were seen as a subservient ally of convenience rather than a true comrade. And it showed. But it was that mistreatment which sowed resentment. And it was that resentment which brought the world to the brink of a third and final global war. It all started when the Third Reich was defeated, when Hitler defeated Hitler. The world was rebuilding. New borders were being drawn, physical borders and ideological borders. Two giants of this new world emerged. The Soviet Union, an established superpower led by Joseph Stalin, and the new kid on the block, Chairman Mao's China. Both shared a lot in common. They were born out of bloody revolutions, foreign occupation, and a purge or two. Add to that an outspoken hatred of capitalism plus contempt for imperialism, and you have all the conditions you need for the perfect alliance. Together, they'd be able to usher in the global workers' paradise. So they made things official in 1950 with the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. And yes, that was the real name. It might sound like a secret item from Skyrim or an unknown finishing move from Mortal Kombat, but in reality, giving their formal alliance an obvious name like this was important to their mission. They were making two big claims for themselves. The first was their visions were united. Second, nothing would ever come between them. Crucially, the Treaty of Friendship promised economic aid and military support from the USSR to help China rebuild after years of devastation. In practice, this means billions of rubles in loans, technical expertise for industrial projects, plus top-of-the-line military equipment to bolster China's defense. Well, top of the line by communist standards. The point is, the USSR had stuck their necks out for China. Soviet advisors flooded into China to develop infrastructure, while Chinese officials visited Moscow to learn about governance and planning. To an outsider, things were going smoothly. The USSR had taken Mao's China under its wing, and soon China would be on an even playing field with its Russian ally. However, insiders saw a different story. They saw cracks forming. Mao viewed Stalin as a mentor, but resented being treated as a subordinate. Take the moment Mao arrived in Moscow to negotiate their friendship agreement. Initially, Stalin refused to meet the revolutionary leader for weeks. Mao was left waiting at a guest house, which he later said was a humiliating experience. And when it came to figuring out the finer details of the treaty, Stalin avoided communicating directly with Mao. Instead, it was up to lieutenants to delegate negotiations. Reportedly, Mao called Stalin personally, but was told by an aide that the great leader was not home. Imagine being left on read by the architect of the Great Terror. When Stalin did eventually meet with Mao, he did so only to attach conditions to the treaty which emphasizes Soviet dominance. Things like retaining privileges in Manchuria, control over the Chinese Eastern Railway, and access to what is now known as Port Arthur. Interesting how even communists talk about fairness, but the moment they come to trade, one has to come out on top. Mao did initially push back on these terms, but the damage was done. Sino-Soviet relations were strained before they'd officially started. And if you were thinking things mellowed out when Stalin died shortly after, in 1953, guess again. Even with Nikita Khrushchev taking over the Soviet Union, things were never the same. Soon, one of them would backstab the other. The only question was, which one would do it first? and which one would take it to the next level by dropping a nuclear bomb. It's time to learn how history works, as we remember that time Russia almost nuked China. As the 1960s approached, the world had been rebuilding into a post-World War II image. America and Japan were now working together to rebuild the Asian nation, and European powers were redrawing boundaries and forging new partnerships. But for the big commies on campus, things were about to take a turn for the worse. In 1956, Khrushchev denounced Joseph Stalin during his famous secret speech. But this speech shocked Mao not just because he was witnessing how the Soviet line of succession reacted to the legacy of its revolutionary heroes. Despite falling out with the mustachioed dictator, Mao still believed in utopia. That's why the real concern was how Khrushchev was reverting the USSR to a Leninist model. Each OG Russian revolutionary had their own idea of how to implement communism, like having their own preferred version of an operating system. Imagine America as an Apple user watching the USSR debate which Windows version to use. To a casual computer observer, there's no meaningful difference between Windows XP or Windows 95. But to someone like Mao, these distinctions were everything. He believed in a strong, centralized leadership, but Khrushchev wanted to move the USSR away from its authoritarian legacy. However, the biggest betrayal of revolutionary principles was what Khrushchev dubbed peaceful coexistence with capitalist states. Mao wanted global communism. Not through compromise, but through confrontation. To him, if someone wasn't red, then they should be dead. For Khrushchev, practicalities trumped ideals. Now, the two former friends mistrusted each other and started to prioritize their own strategic concerns over their unified communist goals. That's why Russia was reluctant to share nuclear technology with China, despite being essential for China's security and status as a global power. Mao naturally saw this as more proof that Russia was determined to keep China on a leash, a useful ally when Russia needed it, so long as China knew it was a sidekick and not a main character. So what did Mao do? He started China's own nuclear weapons program. By now, Moscow had already withdrawn its support for Beijing, yet they were nonetheless alarmed. They'd underestimated China's ability to leapfrog them, especially by using the knowledge and information Russia had given them. Russia tried to reassure China of their nuclear umbrella, the communist equivalent of a NATO defense pact whereby a socialist country would defend other states against imperialist aggression. Unfortunately for Moscow, Mao took this gesture as even more evidence that Russia was trying to call the shots. To him, it was obvious that this ploy was intended to mask the Soviets' fears of China independently advancing to become the indisputable leader of all things communist. Whether this was paranoia or truth didn't matter because in 1969, the clash between ideals and practicalities reached breaking point. Much of the vast border between the two countries was poorly defined. We're talking thousands of miles that needed to be agreed upon. One sticking point was the Ussuri River. To cut a long story short, whoever won the argument over this piece of land would ultimately decide which state was on top, and thus which communist country should lead the way for utopia. Russia's gambit for communist leadership came from establishing parties in Europe and Asia. China championed revolutionary movements across the developing world, but by bolstering their strength through proxies and satellite states, it forced these smaller nations to choose sides. This weakened any cohesion for a unified international communist bloc and sped up infighting to create two distinct sides. When the Soviet Union pulled its support from China, including economic aid, it meant their alliance was officially collapsing. All that was left was a theatre of violence with the Ussuri River as the stage. In March 1969, tensions boiled over into open conflict along the disputed border. The most infamous skirmish occurred on Zhenbao Island, or Damansky Island if you're Russian. If you look at a world map, you'd see how this small landmass is strategically insignificant. But if you've been through a messy breakup, then you'd know the importance isn't what something is, but what it represents. Back in the 19th century, China was forced to sign an unequal treaty with Tsarist Russia, which ceded vast amounts of Chinese territory while leaving the border poorly defined. So this tiny island was the symbol of the long-standing territorial dispute. Though Mao had been challenging the historical arrangements, as well as demanding a negotiation of the border, the Soviets left him on red once again. Both nations built up their forces along the river throughout the 1960s, waiting for the day that everything came to a head. By 1968, the Soviets had stationed around 375,000 troops, 1,200 aircraft, and 120 medium-range missiles. China had deployed 1.5 million soldiers, ready to wage asymmetrical warfare. It was one of the largest militarized zones in the history of the world. Who started the fighting depends on who you ask. If you'd ask Mao, he'd have blamed the Soviets for their Brezhnev doctrine. It justified interventions in other socialist states, which Mao recognized as a direct threat to China's sovereignty. If you ask the Soviets who triggered the fighting, they'd say it was the Chinese soldiers who ambushed a Soviet border patrol on March 2nd, 1969. Chinese sources paint this as a defensive measure, though most historians agree it was a premeditated strike to assert China's dominance once and for all. Think of it like the USSR teaching China how to play poker, only for Mao to become a high roller. Then, when they find themselves sitting at the same casino table, China goes all in. 31 Soviet soldiers lost their lives. The number of Chinese fatalities is unknown. By March 15th, Soviet forces retaliated with tanks, armoured personnel carriers, and artillery strikes. There was no mistake. This skirmish wasn't a one-off thing. According to reports, the Soviets fired tens of thousands of artillery rounds in a single day, in case you were wondering how intense the fighting was. Both sides suffered significant losses, with the Soviets eventually regaining control of the island. However, they failed to establish a permanent presence, which meant the conflict didn't have a definitive conclusion that both countries could agree upon. Imagine that. Communists disagreeing with the nature of reality. By August of that year, clashes had broken out beyond the Zhenbao Island incident. Things were escalating fast. Both sides looked poised to enter a full-scale war with one another. While things were escalating, reports were leaving the USSR that the Soviets were considering the nuclear option. Was this a poker play by the Russians to see if China would flinch, or was the threat real? We may never know the answer, but we do know that at this time, Beijing's growing nuclear capabilities were nothing to brush off. China put its nuclear forces on high alert for the first time in history. With friends like these, why do communists need enemies? Thankfully, in September 1969, cooler heads prevailed. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin met with Chinese Premier Zhao Enlai in Beijing to negotiate a ceasefire. An agreement was reached to return to the status quo, though tensions remained high for years afterwards. In fact, the territorial dispute was only officially resolved at the turn of the millennium. In 2003, an agreement was signed, and in 2008 it was ratified. Part of the agreement was China getting Zhenbao Island, though recent developments suggest that the water isn't completely under the bridge. In 2023, China released a standard map, which claimed full sovereignty over another island, disputing the previous agreement that this particular landmass would be evenly split. Russia brushed off the map and claimed that the issue had been settled long ago, but such muted responses are often the tactic of Russian leaders. It seems the Chinese are now leaving the Russians on red. But the geopolitical legacy of the Sino-Soviet conflict runs much deeper than a good old Stalinism versus Leninism story. For starters, it proved how there was no such thing as monolithic communism. Up until that point, the Cold War was painted as a bipolar struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union. But with China emerging as an independent player in a tripolar dynamic, it paved the way for new alliances. In 1972, Richard Nixon visited Beijing. This significant historical moment was partly to improve relationships with China, but also to exploit the Sino-Soviet fallout so that communism could be defeated once and for all. Fast forward to today, and it's clear how this led to China becoming a dominant superpower to rival the USA. Sure, Russia is still kicking about, but in reality, Putin needs the CCP more than the CCP needs Putin. China's seen how capitalism works. They still call themselves communist, but let's be real, there's a reason China has more billionaires in the halls of power than any other country. Add to that their big moves in tech, especially electric cars, AI, and their own space program, and it's clear that the gap between China and Russia is larger than both would ever admit. Putin may be the boogeyman in Western media, but an economist will tell you that China's dominance in the global marketplace is the real cause for concern. They still remain allies, on paper. Russia and China still have a distrust of each other, almost as much as they have a mistrust of America. However, history has shown that these two aren't afraid to go toe-to-toe. Currently, both countries are pursuing their own border disputes, Russia with Ukraine and China with Taiwan. So don't be too shocked when they find another reason to decide which of them should be on top. If you liked this video, check out our one on the man who almost went to prison for saving the world from nuclear war. Be sure to subscribe to keep learning how history works.